White neighbor called the cops on a loud black man. He was rehearsing his Harvard speech. What happens when a young black student rehearses a powerful speech at home and his white neighbor calls the police on him? What unfolds next stuns an entire Harvard auditorium and leaves even his accusers speechless. Monday, 6:42 a.m. That sliver of the morning where the city still pretends to sleep, but everybody knows the hustle's already grinding its teeth. In a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Cambridge, sun was dragging itself through dusty blinds like it too was tired of pretending this world made sense. Michael Daniels stood dead center in his room. 22, college graduate, magna cum laude, black, brilliant, and awake. Awake in the kind of way most folks ain't, not even when their eyes are open. He wasn't just talking, nah. He was speaking, declaring, training his voice like a blade, sharp, rhythmic, deliberate, like he was carving space into a world that's tried to keep it from him since birth. The room was chaos dressed as ambition. Torn pages littered the floor like battlefield casualties. 5 versions of a speech, marked up in red, blue, and desperation. His laptop blinked in sleep mode. A single mug sat on the desk, half drained and bitter. The milk in the fridge had given up days ago. On the wall, a dry erase board with 3 bold words scribbled in thick white marker. Harvard, speech, 3 days. That wasn't a wish. It wasn't a dream. It was a declaration. Mikhail wasn't headed to Harvard for a tour. He wasn't trying to sneak into greatness through the side door. He was invited, handpicked to open a debate summit, to speak to rooms that echoed with legacy and old money and marble pride. So this speech, it wasn't just for show. It was survival. It was proof. It was everything. He paced the room with the urgency of a preacher late to church, arms slicing the air, voice rising and falling like he was orchestrating thunder. He spoke of legacy, injustice, the weaponization of silence, of how this country's heartbeat skips any time a black man opens his mouth with intention. His cadence hit the walls like gospel. But upstairs, it hit differently. Marilyn Brower, 72, peered out her lace-curtained window. Retired professor, old school, real old, the kind who still called soul food exotic and never left reviews under 4 stars unless the waiter had braids. She saw Mikhail pacing, speaking with his whole chest, and immediately felt, what? Discomfort? Confusion? Fear? Probably all 3. And let's be honest, not because she understood a single word he was saying. She couldn't hear his message, but the tone, the force, the sheer unapologetic energy of it, that was enough. She pursed her lips, reached for the landline, yes, the landline, and dialed 911 like she was reporting a burglary in progress. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, this is Marilyn Brower. There's a man downstairs, a black man. He's yelling, loudly. I'm not sure what's going on. Could be a seizure. I'm scared. A seizure. That's what she called purpose. That's what she heard when a young black man dared to rehearse liberation before breakfast. 8 minutes later, record time if you remember how long they took when she slipped at the grocery store, tires screeched outside. A patrol car pulled up like they were late to a shootout. An old Crown Victoria. Still smelled like cold authority and unpaid overtime. 2 officers stepped out. First was Officer Duran, white, broad. Looked like he still polished his boots to feel something. Aviators on, despite the shade. The kind of cop who treated every shift like a war zone where truth was optional. Second, Officer Hellings, Latino, young, nervous. A face that said, I signed up to help people. Didn't know it came with a script. They didn't knock. They banged, hard. Police, open up! Mikhail didn't flinch. He knew the rules. Hands visible, eyes steady, voice calm, but not too calm. Not suspiciously calm, just enough calm to stay breathing. He opened the door. Good morning, officers. What seems to be the issue? Duran looked past him like Mikhail was a curtain, not a person. Noise complaint, potential disturbance. You alone in there? Yes, sir, just rehearsing a speech. I'm a Harvard student. Here's my ID. He held it out with quiet certainty. Hellings glanced at it. Duran didn't even blink. Hands on your head, turn to the wall. Mikhail's heart didn't skip. It sprinted. But his voice? Smooth as jazz. Excuse me, you didn't comply with orders. I answered your question, showed ID. What did I not comply with? Duran stepped forward. Snap. Cold steel around his wrists. Mikhail didn't resist. He didn't yell. Because in that moment, he knew. A raised voice would become evidence. The louder he got, the more dangerous he'd appear. Even if every word was logic. Outside, the neighborhood woke up. Not with outrage. With indifference. A man filmed from his balcony. A woman nearby closed her curtains. Business as usual. Too loud? Call the cops. Too quiet? What's he hiding? Too visible? He's asking for attention. Too invisible? He's suspicious. Being black in America meant walking a line so thin, even your shadow might betray you. Inside the patrol car, silence pressed against the windows. Duran stared ahead, knuckles tight on the wheel. Hellings looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. Maybe he remembered the training manual. Maybe he remembered rent was due. Mikhail stared out the window, not blinking, not defeated, just cataloging. So this is it, huh? You grind, you read, you hustle on two-day-old pasta and overpriced bus fare. You memorize the damn Constitution like it's a spell. All for what? So a tired old woman can call you a threat because your voice doesn't whisper? They brought him into the station. Quiet halls, unmarked doors. No explanations. No charges read. Just a room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights that flickered like they knew a cover-up was coming. He sat, hands cuffed, back straight, eyes closed, and he rehearsed, silently, again, word for word. Because even in a cell, even under suspicion, his voice, that instrument they feared, was still his, still powerful. Outside, the winds were changing. First came Letitia, student. She'd seen them take him. Then Jerome, usually minding his business, not today. Then 3 from the debate team. They knew the speech. They'd heard him perform. Within an hour, 24 stood outside his apartment. Some held posters. Others brought Bluetooth speakers. Someone played the voice memo Mikhail had recorded the night before, his final rehearsal. From the speaker, his voice rang out across the street. America doesn't fear guns. America fears a black voice raised in truth. The irony. Too loud inside, they cuffed him. Too loud outside, they couldn't ignore him. The interrogation room looked like somebody had taken a meat locker, painted it bureaucratic gray, and installed fluorescent lighting just dim enough to offend. It wasn't cold just because of the AC. It was cold because everything in it, the stiff plastic chair bolted to the floor, the metallic scent in the air, the way the walls swallowed up sound, had been designed to suppress, not physically, spiritually. Mikhail sat cuffed, not slouched, not slumped, upright, composed, but every part of him burned. His wrists stung from the metal, his jaw clenched to keep from speaking too early, too loud, too wrong. He knew better than to think silence would save him, but right now silence was strategy. The walls were listening, even if the people behind them weren't. An hour passed, then another. No charges, no questions, just observation. On the other side of the two-way glass, officers shifted in and out like theater ushers at intermission. Officer Duran remained, arms crossed like the law owed him rent. His jaw worked like he was chewing on the fact that this young man, this articulate, composed, too damn loud black man, had disrupted his Monday power trip. He's provoking, Duran muttered, voice low but not low enough. Look at him. Speaks too well. Doesn't flinch. Stares like he belongs here. That's called a citizen, replied Officer Bryant, a night shift cop who joined halfway through the shift change. And he's cuffed in our holding cell for what? Speaking with passion? Duran's face twitched. Authority didn't like being questioned, especially not by facts, especially not on paper-thin grounds. Meanwhile, Mikhail remained still, silent but not quiet. His presence filled the room like a sermon nobody asked for but couldn't ignore. It wasn't fear he felt anymore. It was calculation, because deep down he knew. It wasn't just him they were trying to suppress. It was what he represented. Voice, confidence, visibility. The door creaked open, slowly like it didn't want to interrupt. Enter Detective Avery, late 40s, blazer-like body armor, hair slicked back into control, and a tone so even it could pass for artificial intelligence. She carried a manila folder like it held the fate of the Republic. Mr. Daniels, she said without sitting, you are being detained under suspicion of disturbing the peace and failing to comply with a lawful order. Mikhail looked up, calm, but with a heat under his words. I was rehearsing a speech in my apartment, alone, at 6:30 in the morning, for a Harvard event. He paused. Since when is public order defined by how quietly a black man prepares to speak? Your neighbor filed a complaint, she replied, flipping the folder open as if it justified the cuffs. She described your voice as aggressive and alarming. Alarming to whom? To the wallpaper, or just to her sense of comfort? The chain on his cuffs rattled as he leaned back. You do understand how this looks, don't you? He said, voice crisp. A black student rehearsing a speech about systemic racism gets the police called on him. You arrive, you ignore the ID, you ignore the context, you escalate. Avery didn't respond immediately. Something flickered in her eyes. Not regret, not sympathy, but a flicker of cognitive dissonance. Like the reality she had trained for was collapsing under the weight of this room. "We'll review the building's surveillance footage," she said, flipping a page in her folder like it could protect her from accountability. "You'll remain in holding until then." Mikhail nodded slowly. "Perfect," he said. "Gives me time to reflect on democracy's slow, steady decline into absurdity." Outside the precinct, the scene looked more like a college rally than a Monday morning arrest. Students, professors, community members, people who didn't know Mikhail, but knew why he was there. Because the news traveled fast, and injustice travels even faster when there's Wi-Fi. Dr. Morgan, a rhetoric professor and one of the few black tenured faculty at Harvard, stood near a local news van, her eyes sharp behind horn-rimmed glasses. "You going to report what really happened?" she asked the young reporter, scribbling into a pad. "That this young man didn't threaten, didn't trespass, didn't even raise his voice beyond the confines of his home?" "We're waiting on official statements," the reporter replied. Dr. Morgan's lips tightened. "Official statements are why we're here in the first place," she snapped. "You don't need a badge to recognize that a black voice shouldn't require a permit." Back inside, Officer Helling stepped into the interrogation room. He closed the door softly like he didn't want to disturb the guilt settling in his own stomach. He sat opposite Mikhail, not to intimidate, not even to explain, but to confess. "Look, man, this wasn't my call," he started. "This was all Duran. I followed the lead." Mikhail didn't lift his eyes. "So you just pressed the gas?" "I grew up in Los Feliz," Hellings offered, like that was some sort of olive branch. "I get it. It wasn't easy for us either." Now Mikhail looked up. "Number, you don't get it," he said, voice flat. "Because you stood there and said nothing. You didn't have to wear blue to be part of the system. Silence works just fine." Hellings froze. It hit. Not loud, not dramatic, but hard. Because the words weren't an attack. They were a diagnosis. 2 hours later, the footage came back. Crystal clear. No disturbance. No yelling audible in the hallway. No signs of aggression. Just a young man pacing in his apartment, speaking with purpose and fire. Alone. What Marilyn Brower reported as threatening behavior was nothing more than his truth echoing off cheap drywall. That's when the unraveling began. Internal Affairs was notified. Duran was pulled from duty, his badge suspended. A formal investigation opened, but back in the room it was Avery who returned. She didn't look at Mikhail directly. "You're free to go," she said. He stood. "No charges?" he asked. "None." "So I just toured your holding cell? Is that what this was?" "Formally, you were never under arrest. And informally, a beat. Just another black man who dreamed too loud?" Avery swallowed. She had no retort. Just a folder that suddenly felt lighter than it should. As Mikhail adjusted the sleeves of his shirt, red marks still faint on his wrists, he turned to the detective. "Is your coffee always this bad?" "Excuse me," he smiled faintly. "Just wondering, if you're going to arrest people for their volume, might as well offer decent coffee." Avery let out a laugh. Not joyful, just defeated, because she knew this man wasn't leaving broken. He was leaving with a story, and that story, it was already outside. On signs, on screens, in voices refusing to be hushed. 3 days later, Sanders Theater, Harvard University. The kind of room where the walls don't just listen, they echo legacy. They echo the footsteps of presidents, professors, protesters. Today, though, it wasn't the legacy people came to hear. It was the rupture. Every seat was taken. Students packed the aisles, professors leaned against walls, and security, typically stern and postured, had quietly stepped aside. Because when truth demands room, even the rules start to bow. What was supposed to be a standard initiation for the university's debate union had transformed into something else entirely. A reckoning, an arrival, a response. They weren't there for pomp and protocol. They were there for his voice. The same voice a neighbor had feared. The same voice a badge had tried to cage. The same voice they tried to silence before it ever reached this stage. Backstage, Mikhail sat alone in the dressing room. The mirror didn't lie. His reflection wasn't that of a college kid anymore. He wasn't just a senior with dreams. He was a man who'd been processed by the system and released not because it cleared him, but because it couldn't contain him. Gray suit, clean but modest, as if he didn't want his words drowned by fabric. His wrists still bore the faint reminder of the cuffs. Not bruises, not quite, but the kind of imprint that stays longer in the spirit than on the skin. To his left, a thick stack of speech drafts lay untouched. The same drafts he'd agonized over for weeks. Now they felt obsolete. After what he'd been through, those papers felt like a whisper. His truth had outgrown the page. The door cracked open. Professor Morgan, sharp, deliberate, uncompromising, peeked in. "They're ready," she said, then added more softly, "All of them." Mikhail nodded. No breath, no theatrics. Just stood up, because fear couldn't live in him anymore. Not after having been handcuffed for dreaming too loudly. He stepped into the light. The mic stood in the center of the stage. Unremarkable. Black. Wired. But today it was no longer just a mic. It was a line in the sand. Before him, a sea of faces. Brown, black, white, every color in between. Some curious, some angry, some silently apologizing, but all listening. And tucked into the very last row, nearly hidden in the shadows, sat Marilyn Brower. Yes, her. She wasn't there to apologize. Not out loud. Maybe not even to herself. But there she was. The neighbor whose phone call almost snatched a future out of its own trajectory. Maybe curiosity brought her. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear of what it would look like if she didn't come. But she was there, and Mikhail saw her. He took his place at the mic. Silence spread over the room like fabric pulled tight. "My name is Mikhail Daniels," he began. "I'm 22. I live in Cambridge. And I have a voice." He paused, just long enough for that last word to sit heavy. "Yes, it's loud," he continued, "because silence hasn't saved me, and it hasn't saved those who look like me. So I speak." Another pause, this time deeper. He wasn't catching his breath. He was catching his history. 3 days ago, I was rehearsing this very speech, alone, in my apartment. At sunrise, I was not shouting. I was not threatening. I was practicing. He looked up at the crowd. Direct, intentional. And my voice brought the police to my door. A murmur swept the auditorium. A cough, a chair creak. Someone dropped a pen. The room had gone so still, every sound felt like a statement. "My neighbor," he continued, "claimed she was frightened. Not because I spoke to her, not because I approached her. She couldn't even hear the words. She was scared of how I sounded. Not what I said, but that I was saying it at all." He leaned closer to the mic. "And what struck me most," he asked, voice dropping to a whisper, "not that she called, but how fast they came." That hit hard. The room rippled with that bitter laughter, the kind that only comes from recognition too painful to deny. "When they arrested me," Mikhail said, "I kept thinking, maybe if I'd spoken more softly, more gently, maybe if I'd played it safe. But what does safe mean when your very existence is loud to someone else's comfort?" He began to move, slowly pacing the stage. "Not performing, living. They didn't arrest me for a crime," he said. "They arrested me for tone, for volume, for disrupting the comfort of a system that's allergic to conviction from someone who looks like me." He pointed, not at anyone, but out, into the air. "We're told neutrality is noble," he said, "but neutrality is a luxury. Black folks don't get to be neutral. We get to be invisible, or dangerous. There is no middle." He turned to the front row. "I chose danger," he said, "because I refuse to be silent. I refuse to apologize for being heard." He stepped back to the mic, planted his feet, raised his voice. "I will speak, loudly. I will dream, loudly. I will live, loudly." The room erupted, but not all at once. At first, a single clap, then a few more, then an avalanche. Feet on the floor, hands in the air. People rising, not just in approval, but in solidarity. One by one, they stood, not just students, professors, journalists, janitors. One body after another rising like a wave of refusal. Mikhail stood, not smiling, not beaming, just still. Because this wasn't a victory lap. It was a beginning. Later, when the lights dimmed and the echoes faded, he left through the service door. No cameras, no chance, just Professor Morgan and a sharply dressed man beside her. "The Dean of Communications," she said. "He has a question for you." The man extended a card. "How would you feel about teaching a course on public speech?" he asked. Mikhail blinked, then chuckled. "Not worried I'm too loud for the classroom?" The dean shrugged. "I'm more worried when voices like yours aren't in the room. Because when they're not in the room, they're in the streets." 2 days later, Mikhail found a card on his doorstep. No envelope, just a small white square. Inside, written in the kind of cursive that tries to rewrite history. "I didn't understand. I think I do now. I'm sorry. Ma'am." He didn't respond. Not because he was angry, but because he knew. Apology is not a sentence. It's a process. And not everyone completes it. A week passed, and Mikhail kept speaking. Not just about race, but about voice. About how audibility has become a privilege. About how the comfort of one is too often bought by the silence of another. And the next time the news broke with the name of another young man pulled over, pinned down, or locked up for being too much, Mikhail was the first one to speak up. Loud, always loud.